Picture this. It's June 6, 1944, just before dawn breaks over the Normandy coastline. Inside a concrete bunker overlooking Omaha Beach, a telephone rings, cutting through the silence. Major Werner Pluskat picks it up, and what he hears makes his blood run cold. Ships. Hundreds of them. Emerging through the morning mist like ghosts materializing from nowhere. He grabs his binoculars with shaking hands, scans the horizon, and sees something that shouldn't be possible. The largest armada ever assembled in human history, stretching as far as his eyes can see. He speaks 3 words into the phone, his voice barely steady. Das ist es. This is it. For 2 solid years, the German High Command had been preparing for an invasion, but not here, not in Normandy. They expected it at Pas-de-Calais, 200 kilometers to the northeast. That's where they'd poured their resources, building 15,000 fortifications, positioning 300,000 troops, mapping every possible landing zone with meticulous German precision. Now, as American, British, and Canadian soldiers storm 5 beaches across a 50-mile front, German officers from small battalion posts all the way up to army headquarters are scrambling, trying to make sense of what their own eyes are telling them. The invasion they'd been waiting for had begun, but in the one place they weren't ready. And here's the most incredible part. The most powerful army in Europe couldn't move, couldn't respond, couldn't do anything, because the one man who could authorize a counterattack was still asleep. Let that sink in for a moment. The fate of empires, hanging on whether someone remembered to set an alarm clock. The maps covering the walls of Wehrmacht headquarters near Paris showed what looked like an impenetrable fortress. The Atlantic Wall, they called it, stretching from Norway all the way down to Spain. 3 years of construction, billions of Reichsmarks poured into concrete and steel. Under dim light bulbs, Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt's staff officers would bend over their coastal defense charts, tracing their fingers along the Pas-de-Calais sector, convinced beyond any doubt that this was where the Allies would come. The logic seemed unassailable, almost mathematical in its certainty. It was the shortest crossing from England, the closest route to Germany's industrial heartland, and it offered the quickest path to the Ruhr Valley. Everything pointed to Pas-de-Calais. Everything. Meanwhile, down in St. Lo, General Erich Marx commanded the 84th Corps, responsible for defending Normandy, which everyone considered a quiet sector, a secondary defensive zone where nothing important would happen. On June 5th, his 53rd birthday, he'd toasted with his officers to another peaceful day. His staff filed routine reports by lamplight, pens scratching on paper, the only sound breaking the evening silence. Outside, the Atlantic Wall's concrete observation posts stood watch over empty beaches. These weren't amateurs making these assessments. These were officers who had conquered Poland in weeks, France in months, and pushed deep into the Soviet Union. They understood mechanized warfare, they knew operational doctrine inside and out, and they certainly understood the mathematics of amphibious assault. Their confidence wasn't arrogance in the traditional sense. It was professional certainty, built on 3 years of meticulous preparation and backed by what seemed like irrefutable logic. But here's the thing about confidence, no matter how well-founded. It cannot survive contact with reality. The German officers stationed in Normandy knew their sector was considered secondary, the place where nothing would happen. The 716th Infantry Division manning the coastal defenses wasn't exactly Germany's finest. These were men in their 30s and 40s, veterans recovering from wounds suffered on the brutal Eastern Front, soldiers who'd been fighting since Poland and desperately needed a few quiet months to heal. Some units consisted of Ostbataillon, conscripted Poles and Russians whose loyalty Wehrmacht command openly questioned, but whose bodies could at least man observation posts and trenches. Major Friedrich Hayne, The intelligence officer at Mark's headquarters had been filing reports throughout May, noting increased Allied reconnaissance flights over Normandy. But his analysis sat in filing cabinets, interpreted through the lens of what everyone expected. Allied deception tactics. Of course, they would feint at Normandy to disguise their real objective at Pas-de-Calais. It made perfect sense. In the coastal bunkers, officers like Werner Pluscat maintained watch rotations that had become mind-numbingly routine. They filled out duty logs by candlelight, noting in personal diaries the sheer monotony of garrison life, where the most exciting event might be a supply truck arriving late or a soldier getting drunk on leave. German doctrine assumed rationality above all else. The Allies would strike where geography and logistics favored them. Every war college lecture, every operational planning session, every intelligence estimate pointed to the same inevitable conclusion. Normandy's beaches were well defended, sure, but they were defended against an attack that wasn't supposed to come. And in war, the most dangerous assumptions are always the ones that everyone agrees with. The first telephone call started coming in between 1 and 2 in the morning. Fragmentary reports that made absolutely no tactical sense. Paratroopers dropping inland near Saint-Mire-Église, but scattered, disorganized, carrying equipment that didn't match any known unit designations. Lieutenant Colonel Friedrich von der Heydt, commanding German paratroopers at Corentin, stood in his command post with a field telephone pressed to his ear, listening to bewildered sentries report American voices in the darkness, cut communication lines, small arms fire echoing through the Norman hedgerows. At General Mark's headquarters in St. Lo, staff officers clustered around the wall map, sticking colored pins where reports were originating. The pattern emerging violated everything they'd learned about airborne operations. No army conducted drops on this scale except as a prelude to something much, much larger. Major Haynes sat at his desk, drafting a situation report with carefully hedged language. Possible enemy airborne activity of undetermined scale. His pen paused over the paper. How do you report something that shouldn't be happening? Something that defies all your training and experience. The reports kept flooding in. A company commander near the Orne River bridges reported British paratroopers not just landing, but actually taking and holding key positions. Another unit reported gliders landing, actual gliders bringing in heavy equipment and artillery. Von der Heydt's voice on the phone carried genuine urgency now. This is not reconnaissance. This is an operation. But an operation for what? Major Werner Pluscat had spent the pre-dawn hours dismissing reports as confused sentries seeing shadows and hearing wind in the trees. His observation post above Omaha Beach sat in concrete 4 meters thick, equipped with rangefinders, state-of-the-art communications equipment, and a crystal-clear view of the English Channel. At 5:45 in the morning, something made him raise his binoculars toward the water one more time. For 10 full seconds, he couldn't process what he was seeing. His brain simply refused to accept it. The horizon had disappeared, completely vanished behind ships. Battleships, cruisers, destroyers in formations stretching as far as his optics could resolve, and behind them, landing craft by the thousands, moving toward shore in waves that seemed endless, infinite. His hands were shaking as he grabbed the field telephone, calling his regimental commander, Colonel Ocker, his voice rising despite years of training to remain calm. There must be 10,000 ships out there. Ocker's response came sharp from 15 kilometers inland. Get hold of yourself, Pluscat. The Americans and British don't have 10,000 ships. But even as he spoke those words, the naval bombardment began. Shells screamed overhead, 16-inch guns from battleships, 8-inch guns from cruisers, destroyers moving dangerously close to shore to provide direct fire support. Concrete dust filled the bunker, choking Pluscat. Communication lines snapped under the barrage like strings. Officers all along the coast began repeating variations of the same phrase into their telephones, voices cracking with the weight of realization. This is not a drill. At Gold Beach, Juno Beach, Sword Beach, the exact same scene was unfolding simultaneously. German officers staring at armadas that, according to every intelligence estimate, shouldn't exist, at an invasion happening where it absolutely wasn't supposed to happen, and every single one of them understood in that moment that this changed everything, that the war they thought they were fighting had just transformed into something else entirely. By 7 in the morning, the reports flooding into German command posts created a picture that violated every principle of operational reality they'd been taught. General Marks stood before his headquarters map in St. Lo, receiving confirmation from 5 separate coastal sectors at the exact same time. Utah Beach, Omaha Beach, Gold Beach, Juno Beach, Sword Beach. Landings across a front 80 kilometers wide. Staff officers were frantically calculating troop strength based on landing craft counts, naval gunfire patterns, and airborne drop zones. When they finished their calculations, the numbers made the entire room fall silent. Major Hans von Luck, commanding a Panzer reconnaissance battalion east of Cannes, listened to radio traffic describing British tanks already pushing inland, and he understood immediately. This was the Schwerpunkt, the main effort, not a diversion, not a feint. Allied air supremacy was so complete that the Luftwaffe couldn't even get reconnaissance aircraft over the channel to assess the situation. Naval gunfire support was systematically dismantling beach defenses in real time, position by position. Assault waves were coming ashore, numbering in the tens of thousands, with more visible on the horizon. At 7th Army headquarters, General Max Pimsel's intelligence staff assembled all the incoming data into one comprehensive picture. First wave strength, approximately 150,000 men. Naval vessels, over 5,000. Planned air sorties, more than 10,000. The invasion of Normandy in 1944 wasn't a feint, wasn't a deception. It was larger than the invasion of Sicily, larger than any amphibious operation in military history. One officer quietly noted, almost to himself, "We don't have the forces to stop this." Marks reached for the telephone to call von Rundstedt's headquarters, his hand pausing over the receiver. He knew exactly what he had to say. He knew exactly what it meant. But he didn't yet know that saying it wouldn't matter, that the words themselves were meaningless without the ability to act. At 8 o'clock in the morning, General Erich Marks spoke words that would be recorded in war diaries, interrogation transcripts, and histories written decades later. His voice was steady, professional, carrying the full weight of recognition and terrible understanding. Das ist es. This is it. The invasion has started. He was calling General Max Pimsel, Chief of Staff for 7th Army, who stood in his own headquarters 80 kilometers away, knowing exactly what came next and knowing it was impossible. Pimsel immediately called Field Marshal von Rundstedt's headquarters at Saint-Germain-en-Laye near Paris. Von Rundstedt's staff understood the situation within seconds. This was the Allied invasion everyone had been preparing for, except it was happening in Normandy instead of Pas-de-Calais. But here's where everything broke down. The Panzer Reserves, the 12th SS Panzer Division, the Panzerlehr Division, the mobile forces that could actually turn the battle, couldn't be released without explicit permission from OKW, the Armed Forces High Command in Berlin. And OKW wouldn't wake Adolf Hitler. Let me say that again, because it's almost impossible to believe. They wouldn't wake him up. Major Wilhelm Meyer, operations officer at 7th Army headquarters, would later describe the scene as surreal, like watching a nightmare in slow motion. urgent voices on telephone lines, officers standing over maps they couldn't act on, movement orders drafted that couldn't be sent. Hitler had taken sleeping pills the night before and left strict instructions not to be disturbed under any circumstances. Lieutenant Colonel Helmut Ridgen, waiting with his Panzer Battalion, engines idling, crews ready, received the same message that every German armor commander in Normandy received that morning. Remain in position. Await further instructions. The words Das ist es, this is it, echoed through command posts across France, accurate, urgent, and completely meaningless without authorization from a man sleeping soundly 1,000 kilometers away in Berchtesgaden. The immediate aftermath of recognizing the D-Day invasion wasn't panic. It was something worse. It was fury, raw and impotent. Field Marshal Rommel, reached by telephone at his home in Hurlingen where he'd gone to celebrate his wife's birthday, reportedly slammed down the receiver after learning the panzers still hadn't been released. His words, carefully recorded by his aide, carried bitter understanding. My God, they've done it. Major Hans von Luck, forbidden from moving his battalion toward the sound of naval gunfire only 20 kilometers away, could only watch as Allied gliders landed in fields his unit should have been defending. He later described feeling rage at the sheer absurdity of it all. At von Rundstedt's headquarters, staff officers drafted movement orders they couldn't send, circled map coordinates they couldn't reinforce, calculated arrival times for reserves that weren't moving. The emotional undercurrent in those rooms shifted from shock to bitter clarity. The Wehrmacht would fight in Normandy without the forces that could have turned the battle, simply because their command system valued absolute obedience over tactical initiative. One staff officer was overheard saying, his voice hollow, "We are watching our own defeat in real time." By 10 o'clock, Hitler finally woke up. By 11, he'd been briefed on the situation. By noon, 12 full hours after the first landings, the first authorization to move panzer reserves was finally issued. 6 crucial hours had passed since Mark's initial call. 6 hours during which Allied forces had expanded their beachheads, linked up airborne units with troops coming from the beaches, and established positions that naval gunfire made nearly impregnable. The German officers who had spoken the right words at exactly the right time now understood a devastating truth. Their system had made accuracy completely irrelevant. The failure wasn't about communication speed or officer competence. Every officer had performed exactly as trained. The failure was about command architecture built on the Führerprinzip, absolute authority concentrated at the very top. Hitler had personally assumed control of Panzer Reserve deployment back in March 1944, overruling Rommel's request to position tanks closer to the coast. The Führer didn't trust his field commander's judgment anymore, not after years of disagreements on the Eastern Front, not after generals had questioned his decisions at Stalingrad, at Kursk, at every major turning point where his intuition clashed with their professional military experience. This meant that when officers like Marx correctly identified Operation Overlord within 2 hours of the first landings, their words had to travel up a chain requiring multiple confirmations at each level. Corps headquarters to Army headquarters, Army headquarters to Army Group headquarters, Army Group to OKW, OKW to Hitler's personal staff, and finally to Hitler himself. Each level added delay. Each level required verification. And the final decision maker was a man whose schedule and psychology made rapid response functionally impossible. Documents captured after the war revealed something even more disturbing. Even officers who privately disagreed with the standing orders didn't violate them. German military culture valued discipline over initiative, always had. Prussian military tradition emphasized obedience as the highest virtue. An officer who acted without proper authorization, even if tactically successful, faced court-martial and disgrace. The system had been deliberately designed this way to prevent another 1918, another collapse from within, another stab in the back. And in doing so, it had created an army that couldn't respond to battlefield reality any faster than the speed of bureaucracy would allow. The Wehrmacht had built a command structure optimized for a completely different kind of war. By the end of June 6, 1944, Allied forces had established solid footholds on all 5 Normandy beaches, landed 156,000 troops, and penetrated up to 10 kilometers inland in some sectors. Casualties had been heavy, particularly brutal at Omaha Beach, where American forces faced the strongest defenses, but they were sustainable, and critically, the beachheads had connected into one continuous front. German counterattacks, when they finally came on June 7th, hit reinforced positions supported by naval gunfire, so overwhelming that Wehrmacht officers reported back, "We cannot move in daylight." The 12th SS Panzer Division, which could have reached Sword Beach by noon on D-Day if released at dawn, arrived piecemeal over 3 agonizing days, getting torn apart along the way. Allied air supremacy meant every road leading to the invasion zone was under constant attack. Tanks were picked off by rocket-firing typhoons. Supply columns burned. Infantry had to march at night and hide in woods during the day like hunted animals. Major General Wilhelm Foley, commander of the 91st Infantry Division, was killed by American paratroopers while racing back to his headquarters, ambushed on a dark road. His staff found his body still in his command car, maps spread across his lap, orders he would never be able to give. The immediate military consequence was absolutely catastrophic. Germany lost the one chance, the only chance, to destroy the invasion at its most vulnerable moment, when troops were still wading through surf under fire, when combat engineers were still clearing beach obstacles, when a concentrated armored counterattack might have actually driven Allied forces back into the sea. Allied planners had estimated they needed 48 hours to secure the beachhead enough to withstand major counterattacks. German officers, through paralysis, gave them that time and more. By June 7th, the window had closed forever, sealed shut by naval guns and established defensive positions. The words German officers spoke on June 6th marked the beginning of an 11-month road that would end in the ruins of Berlin. Over the summer of 1944, the Wehrmacht would fight with incredible skill in Normandy, inflicting heavy casualties, holding can for 6 brutal weeks, making the Allies pay dearly for every hedgerow and village. But without the panzer reserves that should have been available on D-Day, the battle became a slow, grinding collapse rather than a winnable fight. By August, 50,000 German soldiers were trapped in the Falaise pocket, systematically crushed by Allied air power and artillery in what became a killing field. By September, American and British forces were crossing into Germany itself. Officers who survived the Normandy campaign consistently pointed to June 6th as the day they knew, truly knew, the war was lost. Not because of Allied material superiority, which they'd faced before on the Eastern Front and learned to handle, but because their own command system had rendered their tactical competence strategically irrelevant. General Gunther Blumentritt, von Rundstedt's chief of operations, wrote in his post-war memoir something chilling in its simplicity. "We knew on the 6th of June that we would lose the war. We just didn't know how long it would take." The D-Day invasion from the German perspective revealed something far more profound than simple tactical surprise. It showed an army that could see clearly but couldn't act, that could speak truth but couldn't implement it, that possessed all the information needed to respond effectively, but lacked the command structure to translate knowledge into action. The long-term consequence was total and absolute. Operation Overlord opened a second front that Germany simply couldn't sustain. Resources that might have held the Eastern Front against the Soviet advance were diverted west. Strategic depth disappeared. The two-front war became an unwinnable race against time that ended exactly where it had to end, in Berlin, in May 1945, with the Third Reich in ashes. What German officers said when they realized D-Day had begun was correct, immediate, and decisive, and in the end, it changed absolutely nothing. The story of what German officers said when they realized D-Day had begun is not really about failed intelligence or missed warnings. Intelligence was fine. Warnings were clear. It's about the fundamental difference between seeing clearly and being able to act on what you see. Officers from Major Pluscat scanning the horizon at Omaha Beach to General Marks calling from St. Louis spoke the right words at the right time, identified the invasion within hours of it beginning, understood its strategic implications immediately, and transmitted that understanding up the chain of command without distortion or delay. But in a command structure that valued obedience over initiative, that concentrated absolute authority in one man who slept through the critical hours, their words became nothing more than accurate descriptions of their own defeat unfolding in real time. The Atlantic Wall, all those beach obstacles, the carefully planned defensive doctrine, everything became irrelevant because the system designed to activate them couldn't function at the speed modern warfare demanded. The tragedy of D-Day from the German perspective wasn't surprise. Surprise would have been understandable, forgivable even. The tragedy was that surprise didn't matter. They saw it coming in real time and still couldn't respond. And so the words Das ist es, this is it, echo through history not as a call to action that sparked desperate resistance, but as an epitaph for an army that saw its fate clearly but could do absolutely nothing to change it. The most expensive mistakes in war, the ones that cost empires and changed the course of history, aren't the ones made in ignorance by commanders who simply didn't know better. They're the ones made with full knowledge, with clear eyes and accurate intelligence, when the system itself prevents the right response from happening. Somewhere in Normandy, a field telephone lies off its hook in an empty bunker, the receiver swaying gently in the breeze, the line long dead. Outside, waves still break on those same beaches where history turned on words that couldn't save an empire, where perfect information met imperfect command, and where the outcome was decided not by what officers knew, but by what they were allowed to do with that knowledge.